Hey, I'm going to talk about putting strings in cables on Ravin bows. Now, I have not played with an R10 or an R26. An R10 should be very similar to what I'm going to say. An R26 might be a little different since I think it's got different axle to axle. This video is going to get long. I'm going to be turning the camera on and off, and I'm going to show some stuff here. Now, what I want to show here, this is a real live R29 bow. I'm going to tilt my head down here. Over the tops of these cables right here on this cog, you're going to see two dots. And on this side over here, you're going to see two dots. Now this bow right now is a splitting the dots on both sides. And when I measure from the center of this axle to the center of this axle, it's 10.5 inches, okay? That's what you're after. Now remember, R26 is a little bit different. So I'm going to have some pictures I'm going to show of some things you can watch for and get you accustomed to putting strings and cables on one of these bows. And once you do it a time or two, it'll become second nature to you. Okay, now before I turn the camera off, if I put my finger here against the string and I pull, okay, it's going to make this cam here rotate like this. It's going to make this cam rotate like this, which means it will turn the cam back toward the front dot. Okay, so that means as the string is, if it's tighter, shorter, not tighter, shorter. If it's shorter than it needs to be, that would be an indication, okay? But that's what tightening a string or shortening a string does. It brings the cams closer to the front dots. Front dots being up here on front of the bow, okay? These dots here where my fingers are, okay? The cables do backwards to the string. If you tighten cables or add twist to them, it pulls, instead of pulling the cam this way, it moves the back dots toward the front of the bow, okay, which is here and here. Okay, now I'm going to have some pictures that will explain this more. We're going to get into what happens if one cam looks different than the other. What do you do? Remember, when you adjust the string on this bow, it will proportionally adjust each cam. So if this cam is out and this cam is in, you adjust the string. You could get this cam in, but this cam will be out. You'll never get them both right adjusting the string. You'll have to adjust the cables. We're going to talk about it. Okay, so stand by. Now this picture right here is showing a correct setup. You got a cable. When you look down over the top, the bottom cable is superimposed over the top cable. When you look straight down on the bow, you want to be in between the dots on both sides, and your ATA needs to be 10.5 inches. Now this applies to all but an R26, okay? Okay, this example you see right here on the bottom. You see that, okay? Now this right here illustrates a string that doesn't have enough twist in it, okay? It needs to have twist added to rotate these cams around and get them up closer to the center. Now notice it looks the same on both sides, okay? So that's what you would need to do here, is add twist to the string. Bottom example here, okay, notice it's setting up, the cables are setting up closer to the front dots. Okay, this would suggest that the string has too many twists in it, okay? However, if you checked your ATA on this setup right here and you were slightly greater than 10.5 inches, a half a twist in the cables would close up your ATA slightly, and it would advance the cables back toward the back of the cam, okay? Okay, this example right here, I've got a right side, the string is close to the back dot, and over here I'm close to the front dot. Now here's a scenario here where I would probably be more than likely to adjust this side and adjust the cable. Okay. You put your string and cables on this bow, you're going to want to check each pair, meaning this pair here, compare this cable, the upper and the lower, and compare this upper and lower, but you don't compare them side to side to the bow. You compare these two right here, and then you compare these two right here. What you'll do is you'll put a little pressure on the press, and you can turn the press a little bit, and when you start seeing a little slack in the cable, stop pressing the bow. Grab this cable and shake it. See how it shakes? Grab this one down here. If one of them's looser than the other, that tells you which one to put a twist in. Now you go over to this side and you repeat it, okay? Don't put a whole lot of pressure on your press, because you don't want your cables to get too loose, because it's a lot easier to see a loose cable when you barely press it. If you've got a loose cable, it'll show up, okay? You'll see it. It'll be very obvious, okay? And that's really important to make these bows shoot good. Don't have to be perfect. You still probably shoot pretty good if you're off a little bit. Okay, so I showed you what some of the adjustments and how they can affect. Now remember, you don't need to try to fix, you don't necessarily have to fix everything at once, but as you get better at doing this, you may see this cog over here, for example, is over rotated or under rotated, and you may measure your ATA and you sort of get the hang of it, where you'll say, okay, I'm going to adjust these cables and I'm also going to adjust my string during one press session, okay? But when you start out with this, you don't necessarily have to do everything at once, and you'll get mixed up on what you did. So just keep it simple. Now, what I recommend people do is put a twist in each end of the string, put it on. Don't twist the cables at all. Put them on. Okay? When you get your cables on, you look this bow over real good. You look in here, make sure this string is over this right here. You look at each cable, make sure you're under this pulley over here on both cams. Turn it over, roll it over 2 or 3 times and look at it. Double check your work. When you get that done, slide the carriage down and cock the bow. Okay? Cock it back, I don't know, 2/3 of the way if that's what you want to do. You could cock it back all the way and let it set a few minutes. Don't do it in the sun, okay, and out in the heat. Do it where it's cool. Let it set about 5 minutes and then decock the bow. Make sure you don't hurt yourself or hurt the equipment. After you get it decocked, look it over. Measure your ATA, look at your timing, okay? That should get the cables pretty much in place. So the adjustments you make then will have, you won't be chasing your tail so much. Make a few adjustments, whatever you need to do. Cock the bow again. Let it set for 5 minutes. Okay. Just for a reference point, here's what I like to do. If you put your string on this bow and you unpress it, you're a 1/16 short in here on your ATA. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't bother it. Okay? Go ahead and cock the bow, because she'll probably come in. When them cables gets around these pulleys and stuff, you let her down, she'll get closer and closer in. Okay? You need to wax these sections right here. You need to wax these end loops on these cables right here that are unserved. Okay, these out here are served on this center part. These in here are unserved. You need to wax these and wax this 2 sections on this string right here. Now, you don't want to run an ATA less than 10.5, because that's getting hard on your limbs. It might make the bow shoot a little faster, okay, but there's a price you can pay for that. So 10.5 is the shortest you need to run this ATA. Could you run the ATA a tad longer than 10.5? Sure. Will it hurt the bow? Probably not. But it will shoot slower. Okay? Once you do this a couple times and you get used to how it all works, just remember the cables are opposing the string. You're talking about opposing forces. Okay? And if you keep that in your head, it will it'll get you a long ways down the road and you won't get so mixed up. Just visualize grabbing this string and pulling that string back and watching how these cams rotate. That'll tell you what twisting the string does, and then the cables twisting them will be backwards. Just remember now, these two cables only affect this cam, these two affect this cam. But now these two cables can affect your ATA, but cable adjustment won't affect ATA much. Okay? Not as much generally as a string adjustment will. So maybe this will help folks.